Good morning all, and welcome to what is the first of the AfriSam 2021 webinar series. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Leon Serfontein. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of AfriSam. You would have been accustomed to by now for Richard Thomes, our Sales and Marketing Executive, presenting and hosting our webinar series. Unfortunately, Richard recently tested positive for COVID-19. So he's currently in quarantine at home. He is recuperating at home and will be joining the webinar, also watching it, same as you. We wish Richard a quick and full recovery quite soon. This is the fourth edition of what we've now been terming as the AfriSam Budget Breakfast. The format used to be a lot more interactive, with us having the breakfast and in-person attendance. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, this is not possible. But luckily, due to the technology available to us now, the AfriSam Budget webinar is now also available. And we thank you for joining us. As I mentioned, this is the first of our webinars. We have our first guest speaker, Dr. Azar Jammine, who I will introduce to you shortly. The second seminar is taking place on the 5th of March, next week Friday, also at 10 o'clock, where David Metteler-Kamp will be joining us as a guest speaker, and he will focus more specifically on the construction industry and specifically South African construction industry. So we look forward to that as well. If you have not registered yet, please do so. You can go to the AfriSam website or our social media platforms, and please register for that. We will attempt to make this as interactive as possible, and as a result, we will have a facility for you to post questions in the chat room, which we will address once Dr. Jammine has actually finished his presentation. So please take the opportunity to post any questions that you have throughout the presentation as it is presented. And for now, let's get to our guest speaker of today, Dr. Azar Jammine. Thank you very much for joining us again today. This is also the fourth year that Dr. Azar Jammine is joining us with the budget breakfast after the finance minister has done his presentation. Dr. Azar Jammine is well known to, I think, most of you on this webinar. He's the chief economist and director of Econometrics, which is a leading independent economic research consultancy and forecasting company established in 1982. Dr. Jammine has been in his current role since 1985 with a wealth of experience and has established a significant profile in South Africa as an analyst and commentator on domestic and international economic affairs. Dr. Jammine has conducted many of these presentations, over 4,000 is the last count that I have, leading clients and corporations and other institutions, as well as conferences dealing with local and international economic environment. This places him well to, over time, have been approached to be representative as an independent director on many companies in South Africa, where he's been adding a lot of value over the years. Dr. Jammine is also a member of the National Advisory Council on Innovation, a body of experts appointed by the Department of Science and Technology. He's a project leader of the annual production and of a booklet of data dealing with the state of science, technology, and innovation in South Africa. Dr. Jammine was also recently honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the South African Professional Services Awards Association, which is sponsored by Sanlam. Dr. Jammine, welcome again, thank you, and we look forward to your presentation and your input. And I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Leon Serfontein for that wonderful introduction. And what a pleasure it is and an honor again to be presenting at the AfriSam webinar series, what I found, what is actually quite eerie, and please excuse me, I happen to have caught laryngitis at the moment, but I know, I've been told that you know when you've got COVID, and I don't feel particularly lethargic at the moment. But I think back to the it's a seminar that we had a year ago in Sandton, live presenting, and it was at a time when a co-presenter of mine, Daniel Silk, showed us pictures of Wuhan, where there was just no activity going on. There was this metropolis, but it was far from bustling. There was not a single car in sight. And we were saying, oh, how interesting that is. Little did we know that our world was going to change dramatically within 3 weeks. And it's in that regard that I thought, let me start off by showing you the good news. And the good news is that there has been a dramatic fall-off in the rate of infections with COVID-19 in the South African economy over the past few weeks. You can see that on average, we are now recording no more than about 1,500 new infections per day, whereas in the first week of this year, we were recording over 20,000 per day. Nowhere else in the world has the fall-off in infections been as dramatic as in South Africa. And you can see here, I've plotted the ratio of infections in South Africa compared with the rest of the world. And you can see that we have now fallen back to the lowest level that we've been at since basically the start of the virus. And one of the huge ironies in our world at the moment is that this is, I believe, in part a function of the fact that the dominant variant in our latest round of infections in South Africa has been that 501YV2 variant, which everyone around the world is so scared of and is banning South Africans from visiting their countries, despite the fact that you can see our infection rate has fallen off dramatically compared with that of the rest of the world. I wish the Cricket Australia would have seen this graph. Maybe they would have taken a different view about touring South Africa. Anyway, we can see what the impact of the lockdowns following the COVID-19 crisis, the eruption of the crisis, has been, and you can see quite clearly here how there was a dramatic fall-off in economic growth in the second quarter of last year to minus 17.5% year on year. And they followed, as we gradually lifted our restrictions, followed by a recovery in the third quarter to minus 6.1%. Now, minus 6.1%, make no mistake, is still an awful growth rate. But while I've got this graph up, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that if you look back, you'll see that the growth in the South African economy has actually already been in decline for a decade and a half. And in fact, we endured 3 recessions in 2008-09 following the global financial crisis, in 2016 following an awful drought, and there was a recession on already before we went into the COVID-19 crisis. And that was attributable to various structural factors that have impeded economic growth in the South African economy over the past decade. You will see, for example, from this table, these are the IMF data, that South Africa's 0.2% growth rate already back in 2019 was amongst the lowest in the world. And then if you look at 2021 and 2022, you will see that the forecast growth rates by the IMF for South Africa of 2.8% and 1.4% respectively have also been amongst the lowest of any country in the world. So clearly there is a lot of skepticism as to whether or not our South African government will be in a position to undertake the necessary structural reforms to reverse the downward decline in the decline in South Africa's long-term economic growth rate. I will deal with this later in my presentation when I actually look at many of the structural impediments. On the positive side now, turning to the budget, what we saw is that the South African government is a little more optimistic than the IMF in terms of economic growth going forward. Already, and the good news about this budget was that the government revised the growth rate for 2020. Remember, we don't have fourth quarter figures yet, so we're still forecasting 2020, even though the year has gone past. And the government is now looking at a contraction of 7.2%, whereas at the time of the medium-term budget policy statement in October last year, they were looking at a 7.8% contraction for the economy. For 2021, their forecast of 3.3%, which they have left unchanged compared with October, is a 0.5% better than that of the IMF. For 2022, they have revised upwards the forecast growth rate to 2.2% from 1.7%, which suggests a little bit of confidence that some of the structural reforms that have already been put forward by President Ramaphosa in his economic recovery and reconstruction program that he announced in October, and many of which aspects he reiterated again in the January 8th ANC celebratory speech, and then again in his State of the Nation address earlier this month. There is some confidence that some of those components will actually be addressed. From a point of view of the cement industry, which is closely linked, of course, to capital formation and fixed investment, the bad news is that you can see that there was a contraction of almost 20% in investment activity last year. And the forecast is that, the tailwind of this is going to last well into this year, minus 2.4% growth in investment. And only next year and the year thereafter will we start seeing a meaningful pickup. And even then, we're talking about a 4% improvement in each of the next 2 years, which is not as great as one would like to see. Now, historically, I've noticed that investment data are much more volatile. And if we really start seeing an improvement in economic growth, I think these figures could very soon move into double-digit range. But for the moment, the official forecasts are of investment contracting slightly this year and then first contracting slightly further after last year's plunge and then improving by about 4% next year and the year thereafter. You'll see that the inflation forecast is in the region of 4 to 4.5%. Now, why this is so important is because one of the key structural impediments that has been weighing on economic growth over many years is the fact that the country has been investing less and less over time and consuming more and more. That is not a sustainable path for higher economic growth in the longer term. If you do not invest for the future, you will not be able to produce the goods and services that the country needs to consume. And eventually you'll become totally dependent on imports and will not have a domestic productive capability. Now, turning to the budget, what we saw was that the context of the budget was that we had already been in recession even prior to the COVID-19 crisis. Then we saw a dramatic further plunge in activity caused by lockdowns, followed by a recovery as the lockdowns were lifted. The fact is, as I showed you, even in the third quarter, minus 6% growth and minus 7.2% for the year as a whole, that was dramatic and clearly resulted in a massive decline in the extent to which government was able to raise tax revenue. We also saw that the government had to spend, over and above getting less in taxes, it had to spend a lot more in relief measures, in doling out social grants to poorer individuals who lost their jobs, in getting a loan guarantee scheme, which has been relatively unsuccessful, to help taxpayers in companies in difficulty. But on the positive side, and then of course most recently, it's had to bear the potential additional cost of vaccinating the population against the COVID-19 virus. But fortunately, what we have seen in the last few months is that the decline in government revenue has not been quite as bad as expected. In the medium-term budget policy statement in October, the government basically figured on raising 313 billion rand less in tax than it had budgeted for this time last year in February, when I presented at the last budget review. This time round, the shortfall in government revenue compared with last February is put at 213 billion rand. In other words, there has been a relative improvement of 100 billion rand in the amount of tax that the government has been able to get. And so that gave the Minister of Finance a little more leeway in actually planning for this budget. What has caused this improvement in revenue? And I'm going to deal with some of these issues in a little more detail. Firstly, in recent months, the world economy has received a massive boost from extraordinarily substantial fiscal and monetary stimulus. And secondly, the announcement by Pfizer in early November that it had developed a vaccine to fight the COVID-19 virus suddenly generated a huge amount of optimism that the world economy would, after all, recover sooner rather than later. And as a consequence, what we've seen is commodity prices have been surging, especially commodities such as iron ore and your platinum group metals, such as palladium and rhodium. And the companies, South African companies involved in those industries, have been generating a huge increase in revenues and in profits, and therefore having to pay more tax on those. And also they've been using the additional cash to spend on new mining ventures or to spend on consumables, including, I suppose, cement in many respects. And as a result, the revenue from VAT has turned out to be a lot better than anticipated. And then on the other side, my own theory that I'm going to explain is that a lot of people have suffered as a result of COVID-19. They've lost their jobs or experienced a decline in their pay, remuneration. But the people who have suffered are not primarily your tax-paying community. Only a very small proportion of South Africans really account for a huge component of tax paid, and they are mostly people like you and I who are on this call, and we're still paying our tax. We haven't suffered the big declines in income that the poorer sections of society have done. So this has taken, I think, the Treasury by surprise. The key question to ask is now, how has the Treasury used this additional tax revenue in this budget to try? The first thing, of course, is it's helped in terms of helping to buy and spend an extra 20 billion rand or so on vaccines and vaccinations. Another 6.5 billion in extending the social grant to 6 million unemployed persons who can't access other forms of social grant. And people are quite happy and content for government to borrow money to pay for such worthy causes. The payback in terms of rolling out the vaccines is expected to be significantly greater than the cost. Then the third aspect is possible tax increases that were mooted in previous budgets the government has said, no, hang on, we don't want to raise taxes further and depress economic activity still more. If we, you know, at the moment, if we're getting a little more tax revenue than we believed. So that's another little boost to our economic expectations in the coming year. The fourth issue, which is the elephant in the room really, is one wondered whether the government would repeat or not its promise undertaken in October last year that there would be no further increases in the salaries of public servants over the next 3 years as the key component of holding back the growth in government spending. What one is pleased to see is that the government did have the guts to stick to that commitment. The one weakness of the budget is that very little was said about state-owned enterprises and infrastructural commitment to infrastructural investment. I feel that that was a gap that we in the component. Let me take you through a couple of the data showing you what's actually happening in the economy one by one. I'm going to flip through them quite quickly. Retail sales growth, you can see in April, May, plunged by 50%. And then as we moved from lockdown levels 5 down to up to 4, 3, 2, and 1, we've seen a progressive improvement in retail sales growth. But the latest figure for December was still slightly negative. If we look at the breakdown of retail sales, however, you will see that there's two features that stand out, and the one I've circled. Sales of hardware, paint, and glass in the third and fourth quarters of the year grew amazingly strongly compared with what happened earlier in the year. You can see the average for the whole of last year was still negative, but in the third and fourth quarters, we had positive growth, which shows you how negative the growth in sales of building materials had been in the first half of the year. But what this is a reflection of the pickup in informal activity, and the purchases and the cement industry has been very much part and parcel of that. I'm very closely associated as a director of a timber company, the same kind of experience. Somehow there's been a lot of demand around the country for refurbishment and upscaling of facilities. Obviously, also preparing for this new virtual world has meant that many people have been relocating their work space and work location and building on, which has provided a little bit of extra activity, which is also reflected in the line just above that in an extraordinarily strength in sales of furniture, appliances, and equipment, way above other sectors, other segments of the retail market. Mining output also fell by 50% in April, May last year and has recovered back to zero growth. Manufacturing output also down by 50% and has recovered, and my most recent figures are now encouragingly positive. And none other than the Treasury itself has encapsulated the picture in this graph, which shows how in 2019 and 2020, South Africa, well, the economy was kind of moving sideways and then declining slightly, and then took this massive hit in the second quarter of 2020, followed by the recovery in the third quarter. And it expects further recovery over the next few years. But remember, with activity is still well down on where it was prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And according to Treasury, it will not be before the beginning of 2024 that we will have regained economic activity back to where we were prior to the onset of the crisis. As far as the building industry goes, of course, same thing, massive decline. I've just shown you here residential and non-residential building plans passed, and in both instances, you saw a decline of some 50% from 2019 levels to the nadir in 2020. and there's been a relative improvement in those building plans passed since then. But notice that the improvement proportionately has been much stronger in your residential building plans than in your non-residential plans. What is helping the prospects for domestic economic activity is, as I mentioned, the fact that world economic prospects have improved fairly dramatically, not only because of the prospective rollout of vaccines, but also because the world's governments and central banks have intervened in a massive manner to pour trillions of dollars into the world economy. The total amount estimated to have been pumped into the world economy over the last 9 months or so as of the order of $20 trillion. That's around 25% of world GDP. Never before has there been such an injection of new money and stimulus. What it has, of course, done is where's the money coming from? To begin with, the governments, the United States, Europe, Japan, China, have all been borrowing heavily. And you can see how the public debt to GDP ratio of these countries has rocketed. First, it rocketed back in 2008 to get us out of the global financial crisis. Then when they should have been bringing that debt down in the ensuing decade as economic activity carried on improving, they didn't do so. And now we've got a stepwise further increase in public debt, which scares the life out of me. And, you know, people are complaining about South Africa's debt metrics that I'll show you later of around 80 to 90% of GDP. Well, for the main economies of the world, it's 125% of GDP. How do we get out of that mess? Don't worry. Central banks have said we are going to just pour liquidity into the world economy and keep interest rates as low as possible. Here I show you how the United States Federal Reserve Board on its own has added around $4 trillion into its balance sheet in the last 9 months. And the flip side of that is, of course, a lot of that extra money has simply gone in toward pushing share prices to all-time highs. There's a flip side to that, of course, and that is that those who have shares, either directly or through pension funds or mutual funds, have been doing very well. But your ordinary man in the street who doesn't have the financial insight into how to protect his wealth has been left behind. And so you've had a huge increase in inequality as a consequence of this. The other phenomenon to highlight is the change in the direction of investment that we've seen over the past year. In the first 6 months after the COVID-19 crisis, you'll notice that your technology shares completely outperformed the rest of the market. The blue line shows you the Russell 2000 index, the top 2,000 companies in America, your run-of-the-mill. The red line shows you your tech shares, which completely outperformed the rest because people said, aha, virtual technology in a COVID environment, you've got to buy companies involved in communication and in online trading and in environmental issues, etc. And then suddenly in November, you'll see a change in the pattern and the blue line suddenly starts catching up. Your run-of-the-mill companies are now suddenly starting to prove more attractive. Why? Because November marked the rollout of vaccines for the first time and the hope that that would see a return to more normal economic activity in the longer term. In South Africa's case, of course, the improvement in global economic conditions has meant higher commodity prices, as I mentioned. And as a consequence, we've seen tax revenues. I've basically shown in this graph what was budgeted for originally in February last year in terms of revenue from your main sources of tax, what was then budgeted for in October, and now what's been budgeted for in this latest budget. And you can see a relative improvement of 28 billion rand in personal income tax compared with what was expected in October, an improvement of 29 billion rand in company tax, and 37 billion rand in VAT, and a further 7 billion rand in the fuel levy because people have started traveling a little more. Of course, there's been a fall off in revenue from excise duties because for 2 months more recently, sales of alcohol and tobacco products have been banned. But at the end of the day, you can see a year ago we planned to get 1.43 trillion rand in government revenue. Then in October last year, we thought that would be only 1.1 trillion, and now we say it'll be 1.21 trillion. So an improvement of about 100 billion rand. And as I mentioned, it's not only because of bigger mining profits, but also because of the skewness of our income distribution in South Africa and the tax burden. If you study this table carefully, you will see that your top 3 income brackets, those earning over 500,000 rand, 500,000 to 1 million, 1 million to 1.5, and more than 1.5 million rand, account for just over 1 million people out of a number, taxpayers of nearly 7 million and a population of 60 million. So just over 1 million people, and you look at the right-hand column, account for nearly two-thirds of all personal income tax paid. And they are still in their jobs, largely speaking, and some of them doing very well, thank you, if they're in the IT sphere or online trading. So government revenue has not taken as much of a hit as economic growth as a whole. And this process has been going on for some time. The higher income parts of the economy have been ever more prominent in terms of paying taxes, lower incomes paying less and less tax. Thank heavens, in a way. And the way it works through the spending side is, if you look at the middle column, you'll see that 18.2% of households, and then you look at the left-hand column, account for around 85% of all that is spent in the economy. And the remaining 82% of people account for just 15% of what is spent in the economy. And that's why your VAT revenue has turned out to be a lot better than anticipated, because those who have the money to spend have not taken as much of a hit through COVID-19 as the poorer sections of society. Now, the government has recognized this and seen that proportionately, South Africa is up there with the highest tax-paying societies in the world, and have recognized that if they were to increase personal taxes still further, it would start being counterproductive. And that's why they were encouraged to avoid increasing taxes any further. And our normal exercise in seeing what would happen if a person received a 5% salary increase for the coming year, what would happen to his average tax rate. And the 2 columns on the right show you there's hardly any change in the personal tax burden of individuals over the coming year compared with previous years. And that's a nice change from earlier years where those figures showed a progressive increase. The relative improvement in tax collections has also enabled the government to reduce the budget deficits of the country for the next 4 years. The budget deficits we're talking about in the shortfall between planned expenditure by the government and revenue in taxes. And you will see the red lines have come down slightly from the grey lines that were what was presented in October last year. Having said that, notice that all of these figures for the next 4 years, coming 4 years, are way higher than anything that we experienced in the preceding decade. And that is the problem, because it translates into ever higher government debt as a percent of GDP. And you can see quite clearly how public debt to GDP, the ratios have been brought down compared with what we had in October, but are still way higher than where we've come from, especially around 2008-09, when Trevor Manuel's last budget, where our government debt to GDP ratio was a mere 21.8%. Now the government is talking about, yes, it's managed to bring down the trajectory to a peak of 88.9% of GDP in 2024-25, instead of a peak of 95.3% that it projected in the medium-term budget policy statement. But still, look where we've come from, and look where we were intending to go a year ago, and we're way higher. And you might say, yes, but you know, your advanced economies have public debt to GDP ratios of 125%. So why are we so worried? The problem is that our ratings agencies have been getting more and more pessimistic about our ability to pay off our debts in the longer term. And our ratings have been downgraded progressively over the past decade, and now deeper and deeper into junk status. And the net effect is that whereas interest rates, long-term interest rates in the likes of the US are 1.5%, in Europe negative, in Japan negative, we are having to pay long-term interest rates on borrowing of between 8 and 10%, which is 5.5% higher than our inflation rate. And that is higher proportionately than any other country. In other words, the world's investors have become progressively more pessimistic about our ability to pay off our debts, and are therefore charging us so much more interest if they are to buy our debt than is the case with the leading industrialized countries. And you can see what's happened to our so-called yield curve. Short-term interest rates last year, this is what I may have presented to you last year. This is what I'm presenting to you this year. Last year, short-term interest rates were 7%. This year, they're 3.5%. Last year, long-term interest rates were up at 9%. If anything, they've gone up to 9.5%. And that weighs heavily on government's ability to spend more and more in servicing our debt. Fortunately, the improvement in the global environment in recent months has meant that, notwithstanding the parlous fiscal situation we find ourselves in, international investors have been more and more eager to get hold of the 8, 9, 10% interest available on South African government bonds, and have therefore invested more and more into our bonds and saved the day. As a result, the rand has improved from 19 to the dollar to 15 to the dollar, and that has reduced our inflationary pressures. And the rand has also improved because commodity prices have risen sharply, and so we are running the biggest trade surplus we've ever done before, and that relieves some of the pressure on getting more and more money to come into the country. Now, turning to the budget. So we're managing to get a little more revenue than we anticipated, but it still means let's not get out of it. 89% of GDP is still a massive public debt ratio, and people have been getting more and more pessimistic about our ability to sustain such a fiscal situation. So a year ago, Tito Mboweni spoke to us about the yawning mouth of the hippopotamus, where expenditure was surging, government spending was surging, but government revenue was falling. And he said, we've got to do something to close that mouth. And this latest budget deliberately tries to do that by slashing government spending from over 30% of GDP down to less than 26% of GDP. That is unprecedented, but comes at the cost of what's the main element that enables government to cut back on its spending so as not to have to borrow even more excessively. Public sector remuneration, no more than 2.1% increase next year, 0.9% the year thereafter, 0.5% the year after that. In the face of inflation of 4.5%, that means real declines in public sector remuneration of between 3 and 4% per annum in each of the next 3 years, which means that the average public servant in 3 years' time will be 10%, will have 10% less spending power than he has currently. Now, that, many say, is totally justified because the cost of financing the public sector wage bill in South Africa is amongst the highest of any in the world. Only Denmark and Norway spend more in terms of their public service. And I can guarantee you the Danes and the Norwegians get a lot more bang for their buck out of spending that money on their public servants than we do, where so many of our services have to be supplied privately because public services have deteriorated to such an extent, yet we're still paying a massive amount in employing people in the public service. So that is the real crunch of this budget. Is the South African government going to succeed in persuading public sector trade unions to take the kind of real cuts in salaries that are necessary to try and fix our fiscal situation? Because without doing so, you will end up in this situation where our debt servicing costs increase progressively as a percentage of overall government spending, crowding out our ability to spend on vital social services. You can see already how that is manifesting itself. In the next 3 years, the average growth in interest payments on our debt, because it's risen so sharply, will be 13.3% per year. And in order to fund that, we're having to cut back on things such as healthcare spend to minus 0.3% per year, social development minus 7.7% per year. Look at how social grants are going to have to be curtailed in order to pay more interest on our public debt. From a longer term point of view, the only way out of this dilemma is to really get this economy to start growing faster. And in order to achieve that, we've got to address the key structural impediments that have been holding back our economic growth performance. Number one amongst these has been corruption and state capture. And linked to that, the deterioration in the efficiency of state-owned enterprises and their ability to run properly. I've mentioned already a big structural weakness of investing less and less and consuming more and more. Energy insecurity, load shedding, does not imbue investors with confidence to commit to the longer term here. And in that regard, the government has put forward very significant proposals to allow independent power producers to start entering the market in supplying electricity in competition with Eskom. If we look at another impediment to economic activity has been the high cost of data and interconnectedness, and the need to provide greater access to the broader community, to the digital world, if they are to be able to keep up with the new virtual technology that we, at the moment, data are far too expensive. For that purpose, we need to release broadband spectrum. Economic policy uncertainty has been also a hallmark holding back investment. issues such as uncertainty surrounding expropriation of land without compensation, nationalizing the Reserve Bank, introducing a national health insurance scheme at huge expense. All these have been holding back investment. People are unsure. Massive over-regulation and bureaucracy. Over and above these problems, President Ramaphosa has put forward a whole lot of solutions to encourage IPPs, to encourage the release of broadband spectrum, to reduce policy uncertainty. And yet we see that many of his colleagues in government are basically dragging their heels in allowing and releasing licenses for all this to happen. And a lot of that has to do with also the fact that so many of our public servants are relatively incompetent. There is a lack of capacity to implement various structural programs that the government has intended to put into practice. All these, tackling corruption, improving SOEs through attracting strategic equity partners, embarking upon massive infrastructural investment to reverse the ratio of investment to consumption, allowing IPPs to operate, allowing broadband to come into being, reducing policy uncertainty. All of these have been put forward by the government, and yet implementation thereof has been what has been lacking. And President Ramaphosa has been the first to highlight the lack of capacity within government to implement as being a huge drawback. The big challenge here is that part of this arises from the fact that many civil servants have been put into their positions not on the basis of their capacity, their capability, and their qualifications, but because they are well connected and are cadres of the ANC that have been deployed into those positions. That's going to be a tough one to turn around. Another big structural impediment is undue power of the Golden Triangle. Too much power in the hands of government, big business, and organized labor. Small businesses don't get a look in. And finally, at the very heart of all our problems is the lack of capacity on the educational front. The outcomes that we are producing through our educational system leave much to be desired. I got very depressed this week when I saw that with the publication of the matric exam results, not that the pass rate fell from 81.3 to 76.2%, but that the number of students taking maths for matric had fallen by 15,000 compared with the year before. Instead, everyone opted for maths literacy, easy way to try and get through matric. If we don't improve our technical capability and our mathematical and scientific ability, we won't be able to cope with the new technological world that is required to build and engineer a new society. In terms of infrastructural projects, the government has set forward a program of 51 separate projects in tandem with agreement by NEDLAC and big business and organized labor, worth 340 billion rand in all the various spheres that I've outlined here. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni suggested that some of these programs are already underway. AfriSam would know better than I how whether we're succeeding in undertaking these projects. The fact is that in the past, much of the problem has been that even where programs have been set forward, they have not been implemented because of a lack of capacity to do so, especially at municipal level. Tito Mboweni made much of the fact that the government has a program to spend 791.2 billion rand on infrastructural investment over the next 3 years. Now, we've been given that kind of figure for each of the last 2-3 years, and you can see that, don't be fooled. 2 years ago, that figure was 865 billion. Last year, it came down to 815 billion. Now it's 791 billion. So there is a gap. Why is that figure coming down, and yet we are being told that the government is determined to embark upon major infrastructural investment? The real key is whether or not we have the capacity to spend that money. And a couple of years ago, there was a study that showed that amongst municipalities, a mere 9% had actually spent their municipal infrastructural budgets, and around 2/3 had spent less than 85% of their capital budgets. That is part of the problem. So, in a nutshell, the budget, in the context of where we find ourselves in, actually did a very solid exercise. And one is very grateful that the Tito Mboweni is trying to exude fiscal consolidation and a control over public sector spending. But we need to be aware that we have still got huge challenges in terms of bringing our fiscal house into order. The economy is set to improve over the next couple of years, but it's still, at the moment, looking as if it's a far cry from achieving what is really necessary to turn that slowing growth juggernaut of the past decade around into a more prosperous kind of environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor, for the presentation. Very insightful. I think especially bringing it back to the construction industry, the infrastructure spend, I think, key, as you've mentioned. And we're hoping that the impediments, as you've mentioned, will be addressed to actually assist in the infrastructure spend realizing, which is a big multiplier for unemployment, to address unemployment, to create jobs. We will be going to questions now. I will actually address the questions as they came through in the chat room. And we'll start with the first question coming from Sean Smith, saying there's also a huge reduction of 55% in the number of middle-class taxpayers from 6.1 million to 2.7 million between 2017 and 2020. If you have any comments on that drop, Dr. Jammine.
Yes, I need to examine those figures. I know there has been a reduction. I don't know that it's quite as dramatic as that, but clearly what has been happening is immigration has played a role. I think those figures may be somewhat exaggerated, but the government has recognized that the tax base, the personal tax base, is becoming narrower and narrower, and that is why it was disinclined to want to raise the average tax rates still further, which would inspire even more immigration and attempts at trying to avoid paying tax. It is heavily reliant on upper income, middle and upper income taxpayers to fund the rest of its programs. You're really talking here, if 2.7 million taxpayers, that's correct. If you saw those figures earlier, if you can go to that table on the distribution of personal tax, you would see that, you're talking about a fraction of the population of the country actually accounting for the massive lion's share of tax actually being paid in the country. And it's about halfway through the presentation. May be able to. But that is a major impediment.
Okay. We're just bringing up the presentation again. to the correct
No,
slides.
you've got to go back much faster and much further than that. Much further. Yeah. Okay. Much further. It is mind-boggling, though. It is. Next one, next one, next one. There, next one. You know, that's one. That should be it. There you see your 2.7. Well, this would, if you look at middle class, anyone earning over 20,000 rand a month or 250,000 rand a year. If you add those figures up, it suggests about 3.3 million, or less than half of all taxpayers, who themselves only account for 11.7% of the population as a whole. So you're talking about 3.8 plus 5.8% of the population paying around 92% of all personal tax in the country. 5.8% of the population paying 92% of personal tax. And as I've suggested, probably around 85% of all VAT as well in the country, for the following chart. I'm not aware that if you go to the next slide, if you to next, yeah, I'm not aware that the figure that you quote is from 6 to 2.7 seems a bit dramatic, but you're correct. The trend is up. That black line is effectively your middle class, people earning between 20 and 40,000 rand a month, and you can see that they have increased as a proportion of, as a number of the number of taxpayers in the last 5 years alone, from being 26% of all taxpayers to being 33% of all taxpayers. Yeah, it's a debilitating trend.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Godfrey. It's the question, I'll read it. Do you not anticipate a collapse of the current monetary system, like what happened to the gold standard and the Bretton Woods system, due to the excessive debt to GDP ratios in context of massive quantitative easing going on around the globe? Can this go on indefinitely?
Godfrey, you're a man of my heart. You've identified what keeps me awake at night. And it keeps me awake at night, not because of what might happen out there. It could affect me personally over the remainder of my life, because what is happening is financial asset prices are becoming incredibly overvalued, and the central banks reply that they are going to keep interest rates as low as possible for as long as possible. They say inflation is fairly dormant around the world, not to worry therefore, and as a consequence they are happy to carry on keeping interest rates as low as possible, because they know that with their government debt levels so high, if they were allowed to allow interest rates to rise, the governments wouldn't be able to meet their debt commitments and all hell could break loose. So the answer to your question is, I don't believe it can carry on indefinitely, and I am terrified that you can't carry on kicking the can down the road indefinitely. At some point in time, there's going to be a day of reckoning. Was it last night, the first element thereof? I hope to goodness not. But it does offer for me a frightening prospect in the longer term of how the fallout from all this excessive building up of debt and liquidity might end. It's you know what the real problem is? If you've got wealth and you're not in the stock market, you are losing out heavily, big time, compared with everyone else. So you want to keep on dancing whilst the music carries on. But the real danger is when the music stops, you don't want to be on that dance floor. And unfortunately, all the dancers are going to scream to the exits, and there's going to be a stampede, and many will get killed as a consequence. That is unfortunately my prediction of what will ultimately happen with the world economy. The conventional wisdom, if one is to believe central bank governors, is that this is going to carry on for quite a while yet. So in a way, you have to remain exposed to these financial assets, but you know that you could get wiped out.
Well, thank you. The next question, I think, Doctor, you mentioned, I think it probably links into some of one of your closing statements, to say the concern regarding the drop in approximately 15,000 of matriculants that hasn't registered for mathematics. So the skills and the technical skills, I think both mathematics and science in matriculants and at school, a drop in that. So the question, I think, relates to overall a drop in skills, but probably also some element, potentially, it's not clear on the question, if it relates also to immigration. But the question is, could you comment on the skill drain on SA moving forward?
Of course, I believe that one of the contributing factors to why the economy, possibly some would say the main contributing factor to why the economy has been in decline for the last 15 years, is precisely because we have become less and less skilled, partly as a result of the weakness in our education system and the reluctance of people to embrace maths and science, and partly as a result of emigration. Estimates have been, and I've seen various studies, that we have lost around 30,000 people per year, and most of those professional people, through immigration over the last 2 decades. And the suggestion is that figure has escalated to around 60,000 per year more recently. Obviously, last year, one of the saving graces of COVID was that people couldn't travel, and so that did put a little bit of a dampener on immigration. But you see it especially in your civil engineering field, where so many of our civil engineers have gone abroad and are gainfully employed in Australia or Dubai and the like. It is costing this economy dearly. How do we rectify it? We have to start transferring skills from abroad, and there we come across big problems in terms of the Home Office, Department of Home Affairs, making it very difficult for skilled immigrants to come into the country to transfer those skills to the local population. Major challenge, I believe. Now, there's just one thing I would like to highlight. There's also another weakness, is that there's an obsession amongst the ordinary South Africans across all specters of society to focus on the key is education, going to university and getting an educational qualification, without recognizing that the success of countries like Germany in engineering is not to just go to university, but rather to develop skills in specific technical areas, such as becoming mechanics, plumbers, welders, that kind of thing. That is where we also have acute shortages in South Africa, but they are not fashionable, and we've got to somehow change our mindset. In Germany, there are 4 technical colleges to every university, or 4 times as many people go to technical colleges as they do to universities. In South Africa, the ratio is around 1.5 to universities and 1 to technical or TVET colleges. And then also the quality of our TVET colleges leaves much to be desired.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Jammine. I see the next question actually does address and specifically touches on immigration, a follow-up question by Sean as well. But the question also then relates to the potential negative impact on the tax revenue collection, and also how it potentially will impact us going further forward.
Well, undoubtedly, it has impacted negatively on tax collection, and I think will continue to do so in the foreseeable future until we turn around and the declining pattern of the economy, and the government starts undertaking the structural reforms that are needed. And in this regard, I'm in a number of fora with various businessmen and a lot of CEOs or heads of business organizations. And the message I get is that they become exacerbated because whilst they deal often closely with politicians, they don't acquire any sense of urgency and crisis in the minds of these politicians. And they perceive that our politicians are more worried about their own pockets and their own well-being than worrying about the longer-term future of the South African economy. So there is a huge frustration building up. On the positive side, I think there's a momentum also building up of collection of thinkers who are wanting to make a difference in this regard and who want to bring about reform and a social compact that to try and override where the stranglehold that the politicians are having over the economy at the moment.
Thank you. There's a question as well whether this presentation will be available.
It is certainly available, and if you need to ask further questions as well, please contact us at Econometrics. We're available. We've had this long-standing, decades-long relationship with AfriSam, and we are happy to assist AfriSam and its clients as far as possible.
We will also be distributing a link to the entire broadcast, the webinar event today, so you can actually re-look at the entire broadcast when you receive the link. The next question is regarding COVID, and as the world will slowly recover from COVID-19 and we need to repay all of the loans, how will the world and South African inflation, how the world and South African inflation will look like in the next few years? So what is the impact of COVID-19 and all of the debt and loans being incurred on inflation?
Absolutely. Leon, you must know that the easiest solution to debt is inflation. If you've got a certain amount of debt and prices go sky high and inflation increases, the value of that debt eventually disappears. And I can't help thinking that the ultimate thing that can break the world economy is that, and yesterday's skrik, if I may call it, on world markets where they tumbled 2 or 3%, was the fact that with commodity prices now starting to rise, people is beginning to factor in the possibility that inflation may not, after all, be as dormant as Jerome Powell suggests it might be. And if it does start getting out of hand and they carry on printing a lot of money, you could get massive hyperinflation, which would be dreadful for a period of time for the world economy. It would plunge, but it would actually neutralize and get rid of all the debt and you start from square one. That's what's happened in countries that have experienced hyperinflation. But let me tell you, it's not a nice environment to be living in. And we saw it to the north of us in Zimbabwe. We're seeing it right now in Venezuela and Argentina. We don't want to be there, but it's not impossible. And how it pans out on a global scale is another issue. That's why the price of Bitcoin has gone rocketing, because people think that the one way they may protect themselves is by buying Bitcoins.
So the next question is from Desmond. The question is, I'm concerned with the decline of our steel industry. We cannot build with concrete alone. What is the future of our steel industry? And are we going to be reliant on steel imports?
The South African government, one of the cornerstones of its policy is now reindustrialization and localization by local rather than imported stuff. Now, unless you improve productivity to become more competitive, the only way that you can do that is to intervene as government and provide protective barriers to protect local industry. In other words, put tariffs on importing steel from abroad. The problem with that is it leads to higher and higher inflation. And we lived through precisely such an environment back in the 1970s and 80s during the sanctions environment, where the apartheid government put a lot of high tariffs on imports of all kinds. Firstly, that restricted choice, but it did also cause a lot of inflation, and it bred a lot of inefficiency, not only in the steel industry, but elsewhere in the economy. Businesses became ever more reliant on government putting tariffs on their competitors from abroad. It's not a recipe for higher economic growth alone. Now, in the short term, if the government is serious about localization and reindustrialization, then it's going to have to protect tariffs on imported steel to save our local steel industry, unless we can start becoming more productive ourselves. And that means improving education and skills. And it's a long-term process.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, again, links back to some of the structural impediments that was mentioned previously. If we can go down to the further questions.
Every country borrows money.
Yeah.
Who's giving that money? Essentially, it's becoming a vicious circle. And it's the central banks who are basically doing it. And as a consequence, they basically doing it through quantitative easing, getting financial institutions to sell them, and like your pension funds, to sell them their bonds to the central bank in return for cash. And that is the way in which it goes. When a government wants to borrow money, it goes on auction, and companies like Stanlib and Coronation and 91 and Sanlam and Old Mutual buy up these bonds. And if it's foreign investors, it's a lot of the pension funds abroad who also buy South African government bonds. And that is where the whole issue of credit rating plays such an important role. If the credit rating is low, this signifies a risk that the South African government might ultimately default on its debt, and that in turn results in them demanding a higher and higher interest rate to compensate for the additional risk that is involved in borrowing that money. But basically, it's through the financial sector. Every country borrows money, but it's done through the financial sector. And the one strength that South Africa has is we've got lots of very powerful financial institutions, far proportionately much more powerful than in other countries. And that is one of the reasons why the South African economy has not been liable to collapse under this fiscal strain in a way that some other emerging market economies may have done. Because our financial institutions, your and my pension money, is very avidly lending the money to the South African government on a continuous basis, but getting a nice interest rate for it, by the way.
Okay, I think this looks like it is the last question. There's a question, are we getting closer to government realizing that they are public servants and that we aren't politician servants?
I'm sorry to say that, the skepticism is that the politicians are a law unto themselves. They're in a cushy situation. And actually, I mean, this whole, even your public, your trade unions are also seem to be in the same boat. You know, one of the arguments against the unions getting pay increases is, for example, why should they be getting pay increases when 70% of the economy that's in the private sector have had to endure pay cuts, and many of them have lost their jobs? What entitles politicians and public servants to be in the cushy position where their jobs have not been in jeopardy and they've carried on earning well? Why do they then deserve to get more and more pay? That's with the public servants. With politicians, why are politicians not paying taxes? Well, theoretically, politicians should be paying taxes, but the question to you know, did our former president pay his taxes? I don't know. Did Donald Trump pay his taxes? And there's big question marks around there, and it's a whole controversy surrounding whether or not they've really been brought to book or not.
Well, I think thank you again, Dr. Jammine, for a very insightful presentation. I think we look at the, even though we're expecting some growth for this year, although from a low base and GDP only expecting to recover again by 2024 to the previous levels, I think there's still some industries that's going to have some challenges. I mean, just looking at the fixed investment decline that's still expected for this year, marginal decline in this year. So we'll unpack that a bit more next week, Friday. I think please remember, if you haven't registered yet for the webinar with David Mieter-de-Kamp, we will look specifically at the construction industry and what this budget means for the construction industry in South Africa. Please remember to register. We'll get some more insight into that specific to the industry. So thank you very much for joining us again today. And we hope you found the presentation very insightful and valuable for yourselves. And we wish you all a safe year ahead. And we thank you for joining us today. Best for 2021. Thank you.
Good to be with you. I would have loved to have seen you personally, but thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.